The voice carried through the warped pine boards of the general store wall like a blade finding a gap in armor, and Opal Finley stopped walking the moment she heard her name spoken in a tone she had never expected from Chester Whitaker. "I don't care what you think you heard, Doyle." Chester's voice was low and controlled, the kind of controlled that costs a man something to maintain. "What you said about Opal Finley in this store today was a lie, and you're going to take it back." Opal pressed herself flat against the sun-bleached siding of Hartwell's general store, her hand clutching the wrapped bundle of flour she'd been bringing back to her wagon. The afternoon sun of Caldwell, Kansas beat down on her shoulders in the summer of 1882, but she felt suddenly cold, the kind of cold that comes from shock rather than temperature. Doyle Ransom's laugh was ugly and deliberate. "The whole town's talking, Whitaker. Everyone knows she was seen coming out of the Monarch Hotel at 2 in the morning last Thursday. You want to defend a woman like that, you go right ahead. But decent folk have already made up their minds." The silence that followed was so absolute that Opal could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the distant sound of a horse at the hitching post shifting its weight, could hear the creak of the store's ceiling beams in the dry Kansas wind. "You listen to me very carefully." Chester's voice dropped further, which somehow made it more dangerous rather than less. "Opal Finley was at that hotel because my sister, Margaret, took a fall from her horse 2 miles east of town and could barely walk. Opal was the one who got her there, stayed with her until the doctor came, and sat with her through the night while I was out on the northern range. I know exactly where she was and exactly why, because I was the one who thanked her personally the next morning. So the story you're spreading around this town isn't just unkind, Doyle. It's a deliberate lie about a woman who spent her night caring for someone in pain. And if I hear it come out of your mouth again, or anyone else's mouth in this town, you're going to have a much bigger problem than damaged gossip." Opal Finley stood frozen outside the general store. She could not move. Her feet had become part of the dry earth beneath them, rooted down by something she could not name. She had heard many things said about her since she arrived in Caldwell 14 months ago. She had heard whispers about her background, about the circumstances that brought her west, about the fact that she ran a small laundry operation out of a rented house on the edge of town without a husband's name to shelter her reputation. She had built thick walls around herself, practical and necessary walls, because that was how a woman alone survived in a frontier town. But she had never heard anyone defend her like that. She had never heard a voice go quiet and dangerous and absolute on her behalf. She had especially never expected that voice to belong to Chester Whitaker, who was, by every reasonable measure, the last man in Caldwell who owed her anything at all. The door to the general store opened, and Chester walked out into the afternoon light, nearly colliding with her. He stopped short, and for one suspended moment they simply looked at each other, and Opal understood with terrible clarity that he knew she had been standing there, that he had heard the sound of her feet stop outside the wall the moment Doyle Ransom had spoken her name. The color that moved across Chester Whitaker's face was not shame. It was something far more complicated than that, and Opal did not yet have words for it. She had to go back 14 months to begin to understand how she had arrived at this moment, at this doorway, with this man whose quiet fury had just dismantled something inside her that she had spent a very long time building. Opal Finley had come to Caldwell, Kansas in the late spring of 1881, traveling by rail from St. Louis with $37 in her coat lining, a single trunk of belongings, and a letter from a distant cousin named Bertie Ames, who had written that the frontier was hard but honest, and that a determined woman could make something of herself if she was willing to work. Opal was 24 years old and willing to work harder than most people could imagine, because the alternative was returning to a life in St. Louis that had already made clear it had no room for her. Her father, Thomas Finley, had died of a fever when she was 16, leaving behind a modest tailor's shop and a pile of debts that her mother, Florence, had quietly absorbed and then herself died beneath 4 years later. The shop was gone. The house was gone. There was a distant aunt in Cincinnati who had offered a small bedroom and the implicit expectation of domestic servitude dressed up as charity. And there was Bertie's letter, postmarked from the Kansas frontier, which spoke of dry air and hard winters and genuine possibility. Opal had chosen the letter. She arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday afternoon in May when the prairie grass was green, and the town smelled of horse and fresh-cut lumber, and the particular optimism of a place that was still deciding what it wanted to become. Caldwell sat at the edge of Indian Territory, a cattle town that served as the southern terminus of the Kishom Trail, and it had the rough energy of a place where everything was temporary and nothing was certain. Saloons operated next to churches. Cowboys fresh from months on the trail spent their wages with frantic enthusiasm. The town had a sheriff, 2 deputy marshals, 3 churches, and enough darkness in its corners to keep all of them busy. Bertie Ames met her at the depot, a sturdy woman of 32 with sun-worn skin and direct eyes, and showed her the small house at the south end of Kishom Street that could be rented for $2 a month, and explained that there was real demand in town for laundry services because every cattle outfit that came through needed clean clothes and every family in town had more work than hours to do it in. "You'll need a copper boiler and a good strong back," Bertie had said. "You've got the back. I'll loan you the boiler until you get established." Opal had gotten established in 6 weeks. By the end of summer, she had 2 hired girls helping her, a steady clientele of ranching families and single workers, and a reputation for reliable, quality work. She was building something. It was small and it was hers, and she guarded it fiercely. She met Chester Whitaker for the first time in September of 1881, when he came to collect a bundle of pressed shirts for the Whitaker Ranch account. He was 28 years old, tall in the way of men who work outdoors and develop a physical authority without being aware of it, with dark hair and steady gray eyes that assess things quickly and without drama. He was polite. He was efficient. He paid without argument and tipped without being asked. He came back every 2 weeks without fail. Their conversations in those early months were purely transactional. He told her which shirts needed special attention. She told him when the order would be ready. He said thank you and she said you're welcome, and that was the entirety of it, conducted with the brisk courtesy of 2 people who respected each other's time. It was Bertie who first noticed something that Opal refused to acknowledge for months. "Chester Whitaker doesn't need to come in person to collect his family's laundry," Bertie observed one October morning, while they were wringing out a batch of shirts over the yard barrel. "He's got 2 ranch hands who make town trips regularly. He comes himself because he wants to come himself. He comes because the ranch foreman is particular about his order, and Chester is particular about the ranch being managed properly," Opal said, with the efficiency of a woman who has thought through her counterargument in advance. Bertie smiled and said nothing else, which was more eloquent than anything she might have added. The incident that shifted things happened in November of 1881, during the first serious cold snap of the season. Opal had been trying to fix a loose board on her front step before it became a genuine hazard, working with tools she didn't entirely know how to use because she could not afford to pay someone else to fix it and was too proud to ask for help. Chester had been riding past on his way to the hardware store and had stopped without being asked, tied his horse, and spent 20 minutes fixing the step with the calm efficiency of someone performing an obvious task. When he finished, he stood up and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said, "You should have asked someone." "I'm accustomed to managing on my own," she'd said. He'd considered that for a moment. "That's clear," he said. "It's also unnecessary sometimes." Then he'd untied his horse and ridden on, and Opal had stood on her newly repaired step feeling irritated and inexplicably warm and deeply unsettled in a way she could not comfortably categorize. After that, the texture of Chester's visits changed in ways that were subtle enough that Opal could almost convince herself she was imagining them. He stayed a few minutes longer. He asked questions. Not intrusive questions, but genuine ones. the kind that indicated someone was actually interested in the answers. He asked how business was going and whether the cold weather was making the work harder. He asked about the two girls she employed, Clara Hatch and Delia Moore, and whether they were reliable. He asked once quietly whether she had family that came to visit, and when she said she did not, he simply nodded and looked at the floor for a moment and then looked back up with an expression that Opal catalogued carefully and refused to interpret. He had his own darkness. She came to understand gradually. His parents had both died within a year of each other in the mid-1870s. His father from a heart ailment and his mother from a grief that had no medical name but was real nonetheless. He had been 23 when the ranch fell entirely to him, and his younger sister Margaret, who was 7 years his junior and possessed of a brightness and fragility that her brother watched over with a vigilance that was sometimes painful to observe. He had built the Whitaker Ranch into a stable and profitable operation through years of hard work and careful management, and he wore that responsibility in his posture and his eyes the way other men wore their hats. The people of Caldwell respected Chester Whitaker in the way frontier communities respect competence and reliability. He had never been a man of excessive talk or dramatic gesture. He was known for saying what he meant, doing what he said, and leaving dishonesty in others with nowhere comfortable to stand. He did not court the approval of the town's social hierarchy, and was therefore, paradoxically, one of the few people whose opinions that hierarchy actually weighted, which was why what happened in November of 1881 rattled the town's comfortable dynamics considerably. Gerald Prout, who owned the Caldwell Savings Bank and considered himself the informal arbiter of local propriety, had made a comment in the hardware store about Opal's business being inappropriate for a respectable woman to operate without a male overseer. He had been speaking to a small cluster of men that happened to include Chester Whitaker, who had listened to the full statement without interruption, and then said, very quietly, that Opal Finley's operation was one of the best-run small businesses in Caldwell, and that he personally found it more respectable than a bank that had recently foreclosed on 3 homestead families who'd had a bad crop year through no fault of their own. Opal had not heard about this incident until 3 months later, when Bertie mentioned it in passing as evidence of something she had been trying to tell Opal for some time. By then it was February of 1882, and the relationship between Opal and Chester had evolved into something that defied easy naming. He came to collect his family's laundry every 2 weeks without fail. They talked. Sometimes the talking stretched to 40 minutes. He had learned she liked strong coffee and twice brought it, casually, the way a man brings something obvious rather than something deliberate. She had learned he had a habit of reading late into the night when the ranch work allowed it, and had once, without quite planning to, recommended a book she had finished that she thought he might enjoy. He brought it back 6 days later, and they spent 20 minutes discussing it in her front room while the afternoon light shifted, and neither of them commented on the time. "You're falling in love with that man," Bertie told her in March, with the directness of someone who has watched the process long enough and feels that plain language is now appropriate. "That's a complicated thing to say," Opal replied. "Love usually is," Bertie said, without sympathy. "Doesn't stop it from being true." Opal had been carrying that assessment around for 2 months when the night in question occurred, the night of Margaret Whitaker's accident, which had become the raw material for Doyle Ransom's ugly gossip. Margaret Whitaker was 21 years old, bright and lovely, and possessed of an adventurousness that her brother tried not to suppress, while nonetheless worrying about constantly. She had befriended Opal in December in the way that young women sometimes befriend slightly older women who seem to be navigating something interesting, and they had developed an easy warmth between them that existed slightly outside of Opal's more careful relationship with Chester. On the second Thursday of May 1882, Margaret had been riding back from visiting a friend east of town, and her horse had shied at a prairie dog hole in the gathering dusk. Margaret had been thrown, landing badly enough to twist her ankle severely and bruise 2 ribs. She had managed to get back onto the horse at reduced pace and made it to the edge of town before the pain and shock caught up with her. And it was there that Opal, returning from delivering a laundry order, had found her. Getting Margaret to the Monarch Hotel, the nearest building of any size, had been Opal's first priority. The doctor, Benjamin Ames, who was Bertie's husband, had come within the hour. Chester had been out on the North Range supervising a fence repair and could not be reached until morning. Opal had stayed through the night because Margaret was frightened and in pain, and because leaving someone you have come to care about alone in those circumstances was not something Opal Finley was capable of doing. She had walked out of the Monarch Hotel at 2 in the morning to get some air and clear her head, which was the moment several people in the street below had seen her, and begun constructing the story that Doyle Ransom had apparently been distributing through town for the past week. Opal had not known about the gossip. She had been so focused on her work, and on the relief that Margaret was recovering well, that she had not noticed the particular quality of silence that sometimes settled around her in the street, had not catalogued the looks that followed her into Hartwell's general store that afternoon. She had been thinking about flour and thread, and a large order from the McAllister Ranch that needed to be ready by Friday. She had not been thinking about Chester Whitaker at all. Or rather, she had been thinking about him in the background way that she had been thinking about him for months, the way a person carries a warm, persistent, carefully unexamined thing. And then she had heard his voice through the wall. Now they stood on the boardwalk in front of Hartwell's general store in the full light of a Kansas afternoon, and the distance between them was perhaps 3 feet, and Opal Finley discovered that she had run entirely out of the particular armor she had been wearing. "How much did you hear?" Chester asked. His voice was even, his eyes were direct. "Enough," she said, which was the only honest answer. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, something that she had been cataloging without interpretation for months, and she found that she could not maintain that careful refusal any longer. "I'm sorry you had to hear it at all," he said. "I'm sorry the gossip existed. You deserved better than either." "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I know I didn't have to," he said. "I wanted to. There's a difference." She stood there holding her bundle of flour in the hot Kansas afternoon, and something that had been building for months reached a kind of critical weight. She thought about the step. She thought about the coffee. She thought about the book. She thought about the 40 minutes in her front room, and the way he looked at the floor for a moment when she said she had no family who visited. "Chester," she said, and stopped, because the word was carrying more than she knew how to send it out with. He took half a step toward her, not a dramatic movement, not a theatrical gesture, just the small, deliberate closing of distance by a man who has made a decision and is acting on it without fanfare. "Opal," he said, "I would like to take you to dinner this evening at the Caldwell dining house, if you'll allow it. Not because I defended your name and you feel you owe me something. Because I've wanted to ask you for 4 months, and I keep finding reasons to wait, and today I decided to stop finding those reasons." The afternoon light was gold and relentless around them. A wagon rolled past on the street. Someone called a greeting to someone else across the way. The ordinary world of Caldwell continued its ordinary business all around this extraordinary moment, which was happening in plain sight of anyone who cared to look, which several people did. Opal Finley looked at Chester Whitaker for a long moment. She looked at the steadiness in his eyes, and the set of his jaw, and the particular quality of a man who means what he says and has said something that matters. "Yes," she said, "I'll allow it." He nodded once with a gravity that was entirely disproportionate to the occasion and entirely appropriate to the occasion at the same time. Then he reached out and took the bundle of flour from her arms, because it was clearly heavy, and carried it to her wagon without being asked. Opal watched him do it and felt the wall she had been building for years develop a long, permanent crack. The Caldwell dining house occupied a 2-story building on Main Street and was run by a woman named Harriet Grubb, who took her establishment's reputation for decent food and decent conduct with equal seriousness. It was the kind of place where respectable courtship happened, where business negotiations concluded, where the town's social fabric was maintained over plates of roast beef and bread pudding. Being seen there together was a statement of a particular kind. Opal understood this. She put on the blue wool dress that was her best remaining garment from her St. Louis life, a dress that had been made by her father's hands, and that she kept in careful condition as a connection to him, and as proof to herself that she had not entirely abandoned elegance in the business of survival. She pinned her dark hair with more care than usual, and looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, and made herself stop analyzing and simply breathe. Chester arrived at 6 in the evening, punctual to the minute, wearing a clean dark coat and a white shirt that was, she noted with a small private warmth, from the Whitaker Ranch laundry account. He had combed his hair and his gray eyes were clear, and he looked at her when she opened the door with an expression that was quiet and certain and entirely unguarded. "You look lovely," he said, simply and without qualification, and something about the plainness of it was more affecting than any elaborate compliment could have been. They walked to the dining house through the mild May evening. The town was settling into its night rhythms, the saloons beginning to emit the sounds of early revelry, the families behind lit windows moving through their evening routines. The air smelled of dust and cooking fires and the distant sweetness of prairie grass. Harriet Grubb seated them at a corner table with the invisible efficiency of a woman who has assessed a situation correctly and chosen to encourage it. She brought them coffee before they asked for it and gave the menu recitation with an unusual warmth. The early part of the dinner was slightly formal, as first real dinners between two people who have been circling something for months tend to be. They talked about the ranch and the laundry business and the state of the summer cattle runs and Margaret's recovery, which was progressing well. They talked about things they had each been reading. Then Chester said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to tell me if it's too forward." Opal set down her coffee cup. "Ask. Why did you come to Caldwell? I know you came from St. Louis. I know you had a cousin here. But I've been curious about what brought you all the way out to the edge of Indian Territory, and I haven't asked because it felt like something you'd share in your own time, but I want to understand it." She looked at him across the table. The honesty in the question deserved honesty in the answer, and she gave it to him, all of it. The father's death and the mother's slow decline and the tailor shop and the debts and the aunt in Cincinnati offering her small bedroom and smaller dignity. She told him about Bertie's letter and what it had promised, and how she had weighed the certain discomfort of one life against the uncertain difficulty of another, and chosen the uncertainty because it at least contained the possibility of being her own. He listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering the kind of sympathetic sounds that sometimes function as a way to redirect a conversation rather than receive it. He simply listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "You built something real here," he said. "From nothing and on your own. That's not a small thing." "I know it isn't," she said. "I worked very hard to make sure it wasn't." He smiled at that, a real smile that rearranged his face considerably, and Opal discovered that she had not seen it at full strength before and that it had a significant effect on her equilibrium. She asked him about the ranch, about his parents, about the years after he took full responsibility at 23. He talked about his father with an affection that was tempered by honesty, acknowledging the man's qualities and his flaws without the false hagiography that grief sometimes demands. He talked about his mother with a quieter grief, the kind that has settled and found its place rather than the kind that is still finding one. "Margaret is the best thing that survived all of it," he said. "She has my mother's brightness, and she doesn't know yet how rare that is." "She does know," Opal said. "She's just polite enough not to say so." He looked at her with that rearranging smile again and said, "You're probably right." The dinner lasted 3 hours. Harriet Grubb brought dessert without being asked and refilled the coffee 4 times. When they finally walked out into the night air, the town had reached its full evening noise around them, and neither of them seemed in any hurry to conclude the evening. They walked back toward Opal's house on Kisham Street, and the conversation continued easily, without effort, in the way that good conversation does when two people have found the particular frequency they share. He asked what she missed about St. Louis, and she surprised herself with the specificity and honesty of her answer. She asked what he'd do with the ranch if he could change one thing, and he surprised her with the specificity and honesty of his. They stopped at her front step, the one he had repaired in November. She noted that the board had held perfectly through the winter. "I had a very good evening," she said. "So did I," he said. "I'd like to do it again." "I expect you'll know where to find me," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those clear gray eyes, and then, with the same deliberate quality he brought to everything, he took her hand briefly, the kind of touch that is careful and intentional and says a great deal without demanding a response. Then he said good night and walked away through the Kansas evening. Opal went inside and sat at her kitchen table for a long time without doing anything at all. Over the following 3 weeks, Chester Whitaker made good on his intention. He took her to dinner again the following Saturday. The week after that, he arranged for them to attend the Caldwell Community Social that was held on the Methodist Church grounds, an outdoor affair with tables of food and a fiddle player, and the whole town in attendance, which meant that their presence together was noted by everyone and commented upon by most. Opal handled the attention with the composure of a woman who has learned to present a serene surface over complicated interior weather. Margaret Whitaker, walking on her recovered ankle with only a slight careful hesitation, found Opal at the punch table midway through the evening and said, with a directness that reminded Opal of her brother in a way that was both startling and endearing, "He's been different since he started spending time with you. Better different. I wanted to tell you that." "He's been very kind," Opal said, which felt inadequate. "He's been happy," Margaret said, which felt exact. Those are not always the same thing, and with Chester they haven't always gone together. Opal turned the word over carefully in her mind for several days after that. The question of what the town thought about the developing relationship between Opal Finley and Chester Whitaker was one that could not be entirely avoided, because Caldwell was a community of a few hundred souls in which everyone's business was at least partially everyone else's business. There were those who approved warmly, like Harriet Grubb and Bertie Ames. There were those who were neutral. And there was a faction, loosely organized around Gerald Prout and Doyle Ransom and Mrs. Cordelia Hawkes, who ran the Ladies' Improvement Society with the energy of someone managing a much larger empire, who felt that Chester Whitaker was making a mistake attaching himself to a woman without family connections or conventional background. Doyle Ransom's gossip about the Monarch Hotel, which Chester had so thoroughly dismantled in Hartwell's store, had been part of this faction's ongoing effort to establish Opal as unsuitable. It was not the first piece of gossip they had circulated, and Chester's public destruction of this particular instance did not eliminate the underlying impulse. What it did do was clarify something for the town at large. Chester Whitaker had spoken. Chester Whitaker's position in Caldwell's social fabric was such that, when he spoke clearly on a matter, the matter had a tendency to shift. The Monarch Hotel story died with impressive speed after his intervention, because anyone inclined to repeat it now had to reckon with what they knew Chester Whitaker would say in response. This had a side effect that no one entirely predicted. It made Opal Finley's standing in Caldwell quietly, definitively better. Not because she needed his endorsement exactly, but because the community had been waiting to decide what to make of her for 14 months, and his unambiguous public position accelerated that decision in a favorable direction. People who had been politely neutral became actively warm. Invitations appeared that had not appeared before. The 3 new accounts she gained in June came from families who had previously brought their laundry to the woman on the other side of town. Opal was complicated in her feelings about this. She talked about it with Bertie one afternoon while they were both doing accounts at Bertie's kitchen table. "It shouldn't require Chester Whitaker's voice for the town to treat me fairly," she said. "No," Bertie agreed. "It shouldn't, but it required it and it happened. The world is what it is while we're working on making it better." "You're very pragmatic," Opal said. "I'm very pragmatic," Bertie confirmed. "And I'm also very glad you're both happy. The two things can be true at once." It was on a Sunday afternoon in late June that Chester and Opal had the first conversation that moved past the careful middle distance they had been maintaining and into something that felt genuinely vulnerable. They had taken a walk east of town along the creek that ran through the prairie grasses, the kind of Sunday afternoon walk that was both entirely innocent and entirely charged, as such things tend to be. The afternoon was warm and still, the sky that particular deep blue that the Kansas prairie seems to produce with a special intensity in midsummer, and they had been talking about small things and then comfortable things, and then the conversation had found a deeper current. Chester stopped walking and looked at the creek for a moment before he spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I waited so long before I asked you to dinner." Opal waited. "There was a woman 3 years ago," he said. "Her name was Rose Calloway. She was a schoolteacher who came through on her way to a position in Dodge City, and she stayed in Caldwell for 4 months while the school was being organized, and I thought, very sincerely, that I was going to spend my life with her." He was quiet for a moment. Opal did not prompt him. "She left," he said, "not because anything had gone wrong between us. She left because Caldwell wasn't what she wanted. She wanted something different, something more Eastern and settled, and she had been honest about that from the beginning, and I had convinced myself that it would change. It didn't change. She went to Dodge City and eventually further east, and I spent the better part of a year being very angry with myself for the assumptions I'd made." "What did you assume?" Opal asked. "That wanting something enough makes it possible," he said. "That the life I'd built here would be enough to anchor someone who didn't want to be anchored to it. I was wrong about that." He turned to look at her. "I waited before asking you because I needed to be sure I wasn't doing the same thing again." "Making assumptions about what someone wants." Opal held his gaze. "What conclusions did you reach?" "That you built something here on purpose," he said. "That you didn't come to Caldwell by accident or in passing. That the life you're building is the life you're choosing. I might be wrong about that too, but that's what I observed." "You're not wrong," she said. "This is where I want to be. This is what I'm building. It's mine and I chose it, and I have no plans to choose differently." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said quietly, "I'm glad to hear you say it." "I know you are," she said. "I could see you calculating it." He made a sound that was somewhere between surprise and amusement. "You saw me calculating it. Chester, I watched you come to collect laundry every 2 weeks for 8 months. You calculate everything." "It's not an insult. It's one of the things I find most trustworthy about you." He stared at her. Then he laughed, a real laugh, sudden and genuine, and Opal Finley felt something complete itself in her chest that she had not known was incomplete. They stood by the creek in the June afternoon, and the moment stretched, and in the stretching it became clear to both of them what it contained. Chester reached out and touched her face very gently, his hand warm and deliberate, and Opal leaned into the touch before she had decided to, and then was glad she had not decided, because if she had been deciding she might have chosen differently and wrong. He kissed her with the same careful certainty he brought to everything, and it was both exactly what she expected and entirely beyond what she could have prepared for. When they pulled back, the prairie was still and golden around them, and the creek made its small sound over smooth stones, and Opal Finley thought, with absolute clarity, that she had made the right choice when she chose Bertie's letter over the Cincinnati ant. They were standing on different ground now, both of them. The careful middle distance was gone, and something real and warm and terrifying had taken its place, and neither of them seemed inclined to retreat from it. The weeks that followed were the most complicated and the most joyful weeks Opal had known in years. There was something different about navigating the territory of a real relationship compared to the cautious circling that had preceded it. Things were simultaneously easier and harder. Easier because the question of what they were to each other had been answered. Harder because answering that question opened a dozen others that required navigation. Chester began calling at her house in the evenings on days when ranch business brought him to town. They would sit on the porch in the long summer dusk and talk, or sit inside at her kitchen table over coffee, and the ease of it was remarkable to Opal, who had not realized until she experienced its absence how much energy she had been spending on maintaining careful distance with everyone around her. Margaret came into town 3 times a week now with the excuse of various errands, and spent considerable time at Opal's laundry house, helping in ways that were not entirely necessary but were entirely welcome, and talking with the freedom of someone who has found a safe place to be honest. "He looks at you when you're not watching," Margaret told Opal one afternoon with the authority of someone who has done research. "It's the way our father used to look at our mother, like you're the fixed point and everything else is moving." "That's a very romantic observation," Opal said, continuing to sort linens. "I'm a romantic person," Margaret said without apology. "Chester pretends he isn't, but he's worse than I am. He just expresses it differently." Chester did express it differently. He expressed it through presence and reliability, and through the particular quality of his attention, which was complete and undistractable. He expressed it through small, practical acts of care that were consistent enough to be a language. He had repaired the loose board on her porch railing without comment. He had brought her a new copper-bottomed pot when her old one developed a crack, presenting it with a matter-of-factness that dared her to make it into a bigger moment, which she did not. But she noted it and catalogued it in the part of herself that was building a record of what this man was. July brought a cattle drive from Texas that put several hundred cowboys in and around Caldwell for 3 weeks, transforming the town's energy to something louder and more volatile. Opal's laundry business was at full capacity, the 2 girls working extended hours and Opal herself up before dawn each morning. Chester was also stretched thin, as the cattle traffic affected the ranch operations and required extended attention to fencing, water rights, and the 100 logistical negotiations that mass cattle movement created. They saw less of each other for 3 weeks, and Opal found the absence more noticeable than she had anticipated, which was itself a revelation. She had been so self-sufficient for so long that needing someone's presence was new territory, and she was not entirely comfortable with it even as she recognized it. Chester found time on a Tuesday evening in mid-July to stop at her house for an hour, arriving with tired eyes and a quietness that spoke of a hard few weeks. They sat on the porch in the warm dark, and he said very little and she did not press him to say more, and there was something in the comfortable silence between them that felt significant. After a while he said, "I miss this when I can't get here." "I know," she said. "I miss it too." He looked at her in the dark. "I want to make sure you know what that means when I say it. I'm not saying it casually." "Chester," she said, "I know exactly what it means when you say it. You never say anything casually." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair point," he said, and took her hand on the porch railing and held it, and they sat like that for the remaining 40 minutes of his visit. The following events tested them in ways that their comfortable summer evenings had not. In August, Gerald Pruitt made his most significant move yet against Opal's position in Caldwell. He called in 2 small loans that Opal had taken from the bank the previous year to purchase equipment, doing so without warning and 3 months ahead of their scheduled terms, citing a fine print clause about callable loans that Opal had not understood when she signed the documents, and that Pruitt had clearly been saving for a useful moment. The amount was $42, which was the equivalent of nearly a month's profit, and the timing was designed to cause maximum disruption. Opal found out on a Wednesday morning and spent 40 minutes at the bank being told by Pruitt's clerk that the terms were legal and the timeline was firm. She left the bank and stood on the sidewalk in the August heat and did the arithmetic in her head twice, and found that it came out the same way both times, which was not comfortable but was also not catastrophic. She could manage it. It would strip her reserves down to almost nothing and require her to delay several planned improvements, but she could manage it. She did not tell Chester immediately. This was a decision she made deliberately and examined carefully. She did not tell him because she wanted to handle it herself first, wanted to know that she could, wanted to arrive at whatever conversation they eventually had about it from a position of having already managed rather than currently needing. This was the right decision for the wrong reasons, and also possibly the wrong decision for the right reasons, which was the kind of situation that Opal found herself examining from multiple angles over the following days. She paid Pruitt's clerk on Friday with the cashed equivalent of her summer savings, and walked out of the bank with her accounts balanced, and her reserves stripped to almost nothing and her head held at the exact angle she had perfected over years of managing difficult things in public. Chester found out on Saturday from Bertie's husband, Ben Ames, who had heard about the callable loan situation through the particular information network that small towns maintain. He arrived at Opal's house that afternoon with the quiet intensity of a man containing his reaction. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I handled it," she said. "You handled it alone," he said. "There's a difference." "I've been handling things alone for a long time," she said. "I'm good at it." "I know you are," he said. "Opal, that's not what I mean, and I think you know that." She did know it. She looked at him across her kitchen table and recognized that she was having the first genuinely difficult conversation of their relationship, and that its difficulty was almost entirely generated by her own defensive independence rather than any actual failure on his part. "What do you mean?" she asked, which was an invitation rather than a question. "I mean that I want to be someone you tell things to," he said. "Not because I'm going to sweep in and fix them, though God knows Pruitt deserves to have someone explain his behavior to him very clearly, but because you matter to me and what's happening in your life matters to me and I'd like to actually know about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not accustomed to that," she said, "to having someone who has standing to know." "I understand that," he said. "I'm asking you to get accustomed to it." The conversation that followed was long and honest, and moved through some uncomfortable territory, and arrived somewhere better than where it started. Opal talked about the particular kind of self-sufficiency that grief and necessity install in a person, the way it becomes such a fundamental operating assumption that sharing feels like vulnerability rather than intimacy. Chester listened with the focused attention she had come to recognize as his form of generosity. "I will talk to Pruitt," Chester said when she had finished. "Not to fix it, because you already fixed it, but because what he did was designed to harm you, and he should understand that that is not something that can continue." "You don't have to fight my battles," she said, not unkindly. "I know I don't have to," he said, with a slight deliberate emphasis that she recognized from a conversation on a boardwalk in May. "I want to. There's a difference." She let him see the smile she would normally have controlled. "You said that to me before," she said. "It bears repeating," he said. Chester's conversation with Gerald Pruitt occurred on the following Monday. Opal did not witness it but heard accounts of it from 3 different people by Wednesday, all accounts agreeing on the key elements, which were that Chester had been very quiet and very specific, and that Pruitt had been noticeably less comfortable at the end of the conversation than at the beginning. No further callable loans were invoked against Opal's accounts. Pruitt also, in a development that seemed connected, had a change of opinion regarding the foreclosure on the Henderson homestead that had been pending in his bank since spring, which resulted in a refinancing arrangement that allowed the Henderson family to remain on their land. Whether this was related to his conversation with Chester was a matter of speculation that the town enjoyed discussing. September arrived, and with it a shift in the quality of the light over the Kansas prairie, the summer's intensity softening into something that had both beauty and melancholy in it, the awareness of coming change that autumn always carries. The cattle drives had wound down, and the town had returned to its ordinary rhythms. Chester and Opal had fallen into a pattern that was by now entirely natural to both of them. Sunday afternoons, Tuesday evenings when ranch business permitted. The random Tuesday morning, when she delivered laundry to the ranch, and found him at the kitchen table going over accounts, and stayed 2 hours longer than she planned. These were the regular coordinates of something that had become central to both their lives. It was on a Sunday afternoon in late September, sitting on Opal's porch in the warm remnants of a summer that was not quite ready to concede to fall, that Chester said, without preamble and without the elaborate architecture of approach, "I want to marry you, Opal." She had been not entirely unprepared for this. She had been not entirely prepared for it either. The two things had been coexisting in her since approximately July, and she had found it easier to let them coexist than to resolve them. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The afternoon light was gold and patient around them. "I'm not asking you to answer right now," he said. "I'm telling you what I want so that you know it. We can talk about it as much as you need to." "Chester," she said, "what would it look like, practically? The ranch and my business and Margaret and all of it." "The ranch house has 3 bedrooms and a kitchen that's bigger than this one," he said. "Your business can operate from town the same as it does now. There's no reason that changes. Margaret has her own plans. She's been talking about the school teaching position that may open in the spring, so she'd likely be establishing her own household within the year." He paused. "I've thought about the practical questions." "You calculate everything," she said softly. "I calculate what matters," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "My independence is not a thing I can give up," she said. "I want you to understand that clearly before you ask me formally. The laundry business is mine, and I intend to keep it mine. I won't be absorbed into someone else's life without a self remaining." "I know that," he said. "It's one of the primary reasons I want to marry you. A woman who has built what you've built and maintained who she is through everything you've been through is not someone who diminishes by being beside someone else. She's someone who makes everyone beside her better." Opal Finley sat with that for a long moment on her porch in the September afternoon. "Ask me formally," she said. He turned to face her fully, and there was nothing calculated in his expression at that moment, nothing managed or controlled. There was simply Chester Whitaker, 28 years old, a man who had lost his parents and built something from the remainder and learned the hard way that wanting something enough does not make it possible, looking at a woman who had done the same and found the courage to want something again. "Opal Finley," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding, and then he smiled, the rearranging smile at full strength, and reached out and took both her hands, and she laughed suddenly, a real laugh with nothing controlled in it, and the afternoon held them both warmly in its golden, unrepeatable light. Bertie's response when informed the following morning was to burst into tears, which was entirely out of character, and which she immediately began explaining away as a reaction to dust and not sentiment, which convinced no one. Margaret's response was to embrace Opal so firmly and for so long that Opal had to gently extricate herself, and then to say with shining eyes, "I knew. I have known since February. Chester didn't know, but I knew." "February was a strong guess," Opal said. "February was an excellent observation," Margaret corrected, and then pulled her into another embrace. "The wedding was planned for December. Caldwell's winters came hard and fast, and December was perhaps not the most comfortable month for a celebration, but neither of them saw a reason to wait longer than that, and December gave them time to arrange things properly." Opal approached the planning with the same practical efficiency she brought to her business. The Whitaker ranch house needed attention after years of purely functional occupancy, and she made several changes over October and November that were practical and personal. adding the particular domestic touches that come from someone who has cultivated her own aesthetic through years of making a small space work beautifully. Chester gave her complete latitude in this and expressed genuine appreciation for the results. There was a conversation in November that was difficult and necessary, which was the conversation about money. Chester had considerably more than Opal. The Whitaker ranch was profitable and well-established. Opal's laundry business was growing but was still modest in the scale of things. She needed him to understand, and he needed to show her that he understood, that her financial contributions to their joint life were not defined entirely by their size. "I didn't choose to marry your money," he said, with a directness that closed the discussion. "I chose to marry you. What you bring is not measurable in dollars, and I hope you're not going to insult both of us by trying to measure it that way." "I just need to know we see it the same way," she said. "We do," he said, and they did. October also brought one more attempt by the Prue Ransom faction to create difficulty. Doyle Ransom, apparently not deterred enough by Chester's initial confrontation, had begun circulating a version of Opal's St. Louis history that suggested she had left under circumstances that were morally questionable. This was entirely fabricated, consisting of implications rather than specifics, the particular cruelty of gossip that deals in insinuation rather than accusable statements. Chester's response this time was immediate, public, and comprehensive. He addressed it at the monthly town meeting in the first week of November, standing up in front of Caldwell's assembled citizens in the schoolhouse, and saying clearly that he was about to marry Opal Finley, that he had known her character for over a year, that any person in this room who wished to impugn that character should understand that they were not going to enjoy the consequences, and that he personally invited anyone with a specific factual complaint to bring it to him directly rather than allowing it to circulate in the air where it could harm an innocent person. Opal was in the audience. She had not been warned that Chester intended to make this statement, because he had not planned to make it until Ransom's latest wave of gossip reached him that morning. She sat in the third row of the schoolhouse and felt the old walls she had constructed and defended for years do something that walls are not supposed to do. They did not fall. That would have been too dramatic and too complete, but they became something different. They became a garden wall rather than a fortress wall. Something that enclosed a space not to keep people out, but to give something growing inside the conditions it needed. She understood in that moment, sitting in the Caldwell schoolhouse in November of 1882, that she was going to be all right, that she had been all right for a while and had not entirely believed it. That Chester Whitaker, with his deliberate words and his steady gray eyes and his unflinching willingness to stand up in public and name what mattered to him, had given her something she had not known she needed, which was confirmation that she was worth the standing up. She had always known her own worth. But knowing something and having it reflected back from someone who chose to reflect it were, it turned out, meaningfully different experiences. After the town meeting, walking home in the November dark, Chester said, "I should have warned you I was going to do that." "Yes," she said, "you should have." "I apologize," he said. "Apology accepted," she said. Then, after a moment, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said, and took her hand on the dark street, and they walked the rest of the way home without needing to say anything else. The December wedding was conducted by Reverend Thomas Hale of the First Methodist Church on the 14th of December, 1882, on a clear, cold day with a white sky that suggested snow later in the afternoon. The church was full. Bertie sat in the front row beside Ben Ames and was openly emotional from the beginning without any pretense of dust. Margaret stood beside Opal as her attendant, wearing a green dress and managing to look both solemn and delighted simultaneously. Opal wore a dress of ivory wool that Bertie had helped her make from fabric ordered from Dodge City, simple in cut but carefully done, with small pearl buttons at the wrist that had been her mother's. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because fresh ones were not available in December in Kansas, and dried ones had their own beauty. Chester stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that she had not seen before, and that he wore with the quiet authority he brought to everything. And when she walked down the aisle and he turned to look at her, the expression on his face was one that she filed away in the most careful part of her memory, the part reserved for things she intended to keep. Reverend Hale conducted the ceremony with appropriate solemnity and appropriate brevity. When it came time for the vows, Chester said his with the direct steadiness she had come to expect and love in him, looking at her the entire time, not at the reverend or the congregation or the middle distance, but at her, and she said hers back with the same directness, and meant every syllable in the specific, real, unromantic way that makes a promise actual rather than ceremonial. The snow began as they were walking out of the church, soft and light in the December afternoon, settling on Opal's hair and Chester's dark coat and the shoulders of the assembled guests. Several people said it was good luck. Opal thought it was good weather, which was a different thing, and also that she had arrived somewhere she had not known she was traveling toward when she stepped off a train in Caldwell, Kansas, 18 months ago with $37 in her coat lining. The reception was held in the church hall, and Harriet Grubb had organized the food with the thoroughness she brought to all things within her professional sphere. There was dancing later, the fiddle player who had played at the summer social showing up with reinforcements, and the Caldwell community demonstrating its capacity for genuine celebration. Chester danced with Opal for the first waltz, and they were not a perfect pair in the technical sense because neither of them was a practiced dancer, but they were a precise pair in the sense that they had found each other's rhythm and were not inclined to step on it. "We're married," Opal said quietly as they turned in the lamplight of the church hall. "We are," Chester confirmed. "How does it feel?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to answer anything that mattered. "It feels like having something I didn't know I was allowed to want," she said, "and like being glad I wanted it anyway." He held her closer. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." The year that followed the wedding was a good year, the kind of year that earns its goodness through the ordinary accumulation of real things rather than through dramatic event. Opal ran her laundry business from town and Chester ran the ranch, and the daily geography of their lives was mostly separate in the practical sense and completely connected in every other sense. She moved into the ranch house and made it a home with the same deliberate quality she had brought to making her small rented house on Kisham Street a home. Chester gave her genuine latitude and genuine interest in equal measure, which was to say he never told her what to do with the space, but was genuinely curious about and appreciative of what she chose to do with it. Clara Hatch, who had worked for Opal since nearly the beginning, was promoted to managing the laundry operation on the days when Opal was at the ranch, and Delia Moore continued her steady, reliable presence alongside her. The business continued to grow, taking on 2 additional accounts from ranches north of town in the spring of 1883. Margaret did indeed take the school-teaching position, which opened as predicted in the spring, and moved into a small house in town that Chester helped her set up with the careful attentiveness of a brother who loves his sister and is also quietly relieved to see her establishing her own path. Opal contributed her own help in the furnishing and setting up of Margaret's house, and the 2 women's friendship, established in the relatively uncomplicated space of shared work and honesty, deepened into the kind of friendship that is not really a chosen thing but a necessary one. It was in the spring of 1883, on an April morning when the Kansas prairie was showing the first green of the season, and the air had that particular quality of things beginning, that Opal told Chester she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table over breakfast, directly and without preamble, because that was how she told him things that mattered. He went very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not catalogued before, something open and enormous and entirely unmanaged. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Ben Ames confirmed it last week. I wanted to be sure before I told you." He reached across the breakfast table and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in the April morning with the light coming through the kitchen windows and the sound of the ranch outside doing its ordinary business. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Somewhat uncertain," she said honestly, "and also very glad." "Both of those make sense," he said. He squeezed her hand. "You're going to be magnificent." "I'm going to be capable," she said. "I don't know about magnificent." "You are capable in ways that become magnificent," he said. "I've observed this for 2 years." She made a sound of soft protest, and he smiled the rearranging smile, and she thought that there was no version of this she would have traded. Not even the hard parts, not even the thin years in St. Louis, because all of it had brought her here, to this kitchen table, to this man's hand over hers in the April morning. The pregnancy was straightforward, if not easy. The summer heat of 1883 was harder to manage with a changing body, and the demands of the business and Opal's characteristic refusal to slow down to the degree that everyone around her considered reasonable. Chester was quietly but persistently attentive in ways that she gradually learned to accept rather than deflect. He drove her to town on laundry delivery days when she would previously have walked. He appeared at her business at midday with food casually, as if this had always been part of his routine. "You're managing me," she told him one afternoon in July, not unpleasantly. "I'm caring for you," he said. "There's a difference." She used his phrasing back at him deliberately, and he caught it and smiled. Margaret, who turned 22 in the summer and was settling into her school-teaching role with visible joy, came to the ranch on Saturdays and spent time with Opal in the comfortable way of women who like each other and don't need to perform their friendship. She was delighted about the baby with a warmth that was completely genuine, and she had opinions about names that she offered and then retracted, and then offered again with the enthusiasm of someone for whom this is entirely pleasurable rather than consequential. Bertie, who had no children of her own by choice and Ben Ames's patient agreement, channeled considerable practical knowledge into helping Opal prepare, arriving with the combination of medical information from Ben and personal research from Bertie that resulted in a list of preparation tasks so comprehensive that Opal worked through it over the course of 3 months. The baby arrived on the 5th of November, 1883, in the bedroom of the Whitaker ranch house, with Ben Ames attending and Bertie and Margaret in the house. It was a hard labor, the kind that takes a long time and requires considerable effort, and Chester was in the front room of the house for 6 hours being not particularly successfully calm, a fact that Margaret reported to Opal later with the gentle, amused affection of a sister. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas Franklin Whitaker, Thomas for Opal's father and Franklin for Chester's, and he arrived in the world with dark hair and Chester's gray eyes, and a personality that declared itself immediately in the vigorous and opinionated way he approached the business of being alive. Chester held his son for the first time standing in the lamplight of the bedroom with Opal watching from the bed, still exhausted and absolutely clear-eyed, and the expression on his face was one that she would carry for the rest of her life as the thing she was most grateful to have witnessed. "Thomas Franklin," Chester said softly, looking at the baby. Then he looked at Opal. "Thank you." "We did equal parts," she said, with the slight asperity of a woman who has just spent 6 hours doing the less comfortable part. He smiled. "You did the harder parts," he said. "Thank you for the harder parts." Thomas was, from the beginning, a joyful and absorbing presence in their lives. He was also, from the beginning, the subject of enormous collective adoration from Margaret, who arrived at the ranch house on Sundays with the regularity of someone with a standing appointment, and from Bertie, who had apparently reconsidered some of her previous positions on the subject of babies and discovered that she had strong opinions about them. Caldwell in 1884 was beginning to change in ways that could be felt in its daily texture. The open cattle trail era was already shifting as railroads pushed further south, and changed the economics of long drives. The town was becoming more permanently settled, less charged with the transient energy of cattle trade, more concerned with schools and churches and the other institutions of stability. The Ladies' Improvement Society under Cordelia Hawkes had lost some of its social iron as the community diversified. Gerald Prout, having lost two significant social battles in the preceding years, exercised his opinions more quietly. Doyle Ransom left Caldwell in the spring of 1884, moving to a cattle operation in Texas, and his departure was noted without particular mourning by a substantial portion of the population. Opal's laundry business expanded again in 1884, taking on a contract with the new hotel that opened on Commercial Street, and she brought on a third regular worker, a woman named Sarah Finch, who had arrived in Caldwell with her husband the previous fall, and who proved to be efficient and reliable in ways that allowed Opal to manage the growth without losing the quality that had built the business's reputation. She was also managing the business now as a mother of a 9-month-old, which required the kind of reorganization of time and priority that she approached with her characteristic practicality and Chester's characteristic supportive presence. Thomas came with her to the business on some days and stayed at the ranch with Chester or one of the ranch women on other days, a flexible arrangement that worked because everyone involved was committed to making it work. It was in the fall of 1884, when Thomas was almost a year old, that Chester and Opal had one of the most important conversations of their marriage, which was about the future in a more expansive sense than they had previously discussed. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the October dusk, Thomas asleep inside, the prairie going gold and amber around them. "I want to expand the north section," Chester said. "Another 300 acres if the Bergman family will sell. It would make the ranch considerably more stable long-term." "What does long-term look like to you?" Opal asked. He turned to look at her. "I used to think of it in terms of the ranch," he said. "The operation, the land. Now I think of it differently." "How, Thomas?" he said. "And whoever comes after Thomas. What we're building isn't just a ranch, it's what we're leaving." She was quiet for a moment. The prairie evening held them both. "I think about that too," she said. "The laundry business is good and growing, but I've been thinking about whether it could be something larger, a proper commercial laundry, equipment, hired workers, something that could exist independent of my daily labor if I needed it to." "You want to build it into something bigger," Chester said. He was not surprised. He was interested. "I want to build everything I can into something bigger," she said. "Is that compatible with what you want?" "It's exactly what I want," he said. "I married someone who builds things. I wasn't expecting her to stop." She looked at him in the October dusk and felt the specific warmth of being known, entirely and without damage. It was still relatively new, being known like that. She suspected it would continue to feel like something remarkable even after it had been ordinary for years. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, but she said it in a particular register this time, a register that carried the full weight of what she meant, which was not simply an affection, but an acknowledgement of what they had built and were still building. "I love you," he said, in the same register, looking at her with the direct gray eyes that had never deceived her. The night around them was warm and quiet, the particular quiet of the Kansas prairie in autumn, and their son was sleeping inside in the house that had become their home, and the land stretched out around them that was both Chester's inheritance and their shared future. By the summer of 1885, Opal's commercial laundry operation had expanded into a larger building on 2nd Street, equipped with 3 copper boilers, a proper drying room, and a staff of 5 that worked regular hours under Clara Hatch's capable management. It was no longer a small enterprise. It was a genuine business, profitable and growing, with contracts from half a dozen commercial establishments in town, and a reputation that extended to ranches as far as 15 miles out. Opal retained full ownership and active involvement in the business's direction, while managing the reality of being a mother and a wife, and an increasingly significant figure in Caldwell's commercial life. The latter was something she had not initially sought, and had come to accept with the pragmatic grace that she brought to things she had not chosen, but could not reasonably refuse. She sat on the town council from 1885 onward, appointed initially to a committee examining water supply infrastructure and staying, because she was effective, and because the town had come to understand that Opal Whitaker's opinions on practical matters were worth hearing. She was the second woman to serve on any Caldwell municipal body, after Harriet Grubb, who had served on the school board since 1879, and she brought to the council the same directness and careful thought that she brought to everything. Chester expanded the north section as planned, purchasing the Bergman acres in early 1885 and integrating them into the ranch operation over the following year, with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything he did. The Whitaker Ranch became one of the more substantial operations in Sumner County, recognized for the quality of its stock and the reliability of its management. Margaret, teaching her third year at the Caldwell School, had meanwhile fallen in love with a young man named James Aldrich, who had arrived to take over his uncle's hardware store, and who was quiet and kind, and exactly suited to Margaret in ways that made her brother and her sister-in-law exchange a single speaking glance the first time they met him. James Aldrich was 25, steady and genuine, and he proposed to Margaret in the spring of 1885 with what everyone agreed was admirable directness. She accepted with considerably more joy than admirable directness. Their wedding in June of 1885 was a celebration that the whole town attended in the spirit of celebrating two genuinely liked people. Opal stood beside Margaret as her attendant, reversing the position she had occupied at her own wedding, and felt the particular pleasure of watching someone she loved step into happiness. Thomas, a year and a half old and recently mobile in ways that required constant vigilant attention, was managed through the ceremony by Chester with the focused competence of a man who has found that fatherhood requires most of the same qualities as ranching and several additional ones. At the reception, dancing in the June evening outside the church hall, Chester said to Opal quietly, "Are you happy?" She considered this with the seriousness she gave to genuine questions. "Yes," she said, "completely." "Good," he said. "So am I." They danced together in the June evening, better at it now than they had been at their own wedding, having had practice and the comfort of knowing each other's rhythms in ways they had not then. Around them Caldwell celebrated, and the summer night was warm, and the fiddle player played something sweet and insistent. The second baby came in the winter of 1886, a girl this time, born in February with Opal's dark hair, and a ferocity of expression that looked like both of them and neither of them, and was entirely her own. They named her Catherine Eliza Whitaker, Catherine for no particular person and Eliza for Chester's mother. And she was from the first day of her life the most opinionated person in a household that already contained several opinionated people and a very opinionated toddler. Thomas adored his sister with a completeness and generosity of spirit that moved both his parents. He was 2.5 and had very clear ideas about how the world should work, and he immediately incorporated his sister into those ideas as something that required protecting and entertaining, both of which he pursued with considerable energy. Chester, watching his son lean over the cradle to make faces at his daughter in the February afternoon, caught Opal's eye across the room, and they shared the particular look of two people who have built something real together and are, in this moment, entirely aware of it. Caldwell continued to change. The great cattle drives were winding down as the decade progressed, the economics of the frontier shifting as the railroads extended their reach and the open range closed. Barbed wire was changing the land. The Indian Territory was being pressured toward settlement in ways that were not just. that Opal spoke about with the directness she brought to injustice when she saw it, noting at a town council meeting in 1887 that the forced confinement and treaty violations experienced by the nations south of them were a matter the town should not pretend were none of their business. It was not a comfortable statement to make in 1887 in a Kansas frontier town. Chester sat in the audience and looked at her with the expression she recognized as the one that meant he was both proud of her and slightly concerned for her in equal measure, and she gave him a slight nod that meant she was aware of both and was going to say it anyway. She received 2 strongly worded letters in response and 3 visits from people who agreed with her and were glad she had said it. She counted the letters as confirmation and the visits as encouragement and continued to hold her position. By 1888, Caldwell was becoming something different from what it had been when Opal arrived. It was becoming a settled town in the way that towns on the frontier settle, losing some of the raw energy of the cattle era and gaining the more permanent structures of an established community. Schools, churches, a new courthouse, 3 doctors in practice, a newspaper that had been running since 1880 and was increasingly concerned with local agriculture and commerce rather than the lurid reporting of the trail era. The Whitaker household was 8 years into its existence and had the comfortable authority of something that has proven itself over time. Thomas was 6, attending Margaret's school, which was an arrangement of the kind that only small towns create, and which involved Margaret being both his teacher and his aunt without either of them finding this particularly remarkable. Catherine was 2.5, managing the ranch house as a personal domain with the confident ownership of someone who has never been told she cannot. Opal's laundry business had stabilized at its expanded size, and she was beginning to think about what might come next, what else might be built or contributed. She had been talking with Bertie Ames about the possibility of establishing a small library, a reading room, in Caldwell, the kind of thing that several Kansas towns had undertaken as their communities matured. Books could be donated and ordered. A room could be found. It was exactly the kind of project that required someone with both practical organizational ability and the standing to make other people take it seriously. The library project, which she and Bertie launched in the fall of 1888, was perhaps the thing she was proudest of in Caldwell's civic life. It began with 400 books, a good portion of them her own, housed in a room above the hardware store that James Aldrich donated at a nominal rent. By the end of 1889, it had grown to over 1,000 volumes and was used by enough of the town's population to justify applying to the county for formal support. Chester served on the library's founding board with the matter-of-fact commitment of a man who does what is needed and doesn't require recognition for it. He donated $50 from the ranch account and then spent 3 consecutive Saturdays building bookshelves with the quiet competence she had first seen when he fixed her front step in November of 1881. She watched him work on the 3rd Saturday, surrounded by Thomas, who had brought himself along on the grounds that he was helpful, which was partly true and partly aspirational, and thought about all the distances she had traveled since that November morning, the practical distances and the interior ones, and felt a gratitude so large and specific that it required actual effort to contain. Chester looked up and caught her watching him and held her gaze for a moment in the afternoon light of the library room. "Something on your mind," he said. "I was thinking about distance," she said, "and how far I've come." He held her gaze a moment longer. "How does it look from here?" he asked. "It looks like the right distance," she said. "Exactly the right distance." Thomas, who had been attempting to hold a very long board at a helpful angle, took this moment to express an opinion about the distance and his role in it that made both his parents laugh and brought the moment back to its ordinary, extraordinary dimensions. Their 10th wedding anniversary was December of 1892. Thomas was 9, intense and curious and increasingly interested in both the ranch operation and the laundry business in ways that were beginning to suggest a person who would want to understand how things worked rather than simply benefit from them. Catherine was 6, in school with her Aunt Margaret's replacement, because Margaret had taken a position in the new county school system, reading ahead of her class with an avidity that recalled her mother, and creating social alliances with the strategic confidence that reminded both her parents of no one quite so much as each other. Opal was 35 and Chester was 39, and they were both, in the particular way of people who have built their lives deliberately, more fully themselves than they had been at any earlier point. The years had added depth rather than simply age, had confirmed rather than compromised. For their anniversary, Chester had made a reservation at the Caldwell Dining House, which was still run by Harriet Grubb's daughter now that Harriet was in retirement, still occupying the same 2-story building on Main Street. They went on a Friday evening in mid-December, bundled against the winter cold, leaving Thomas and Catherine with Margaret and James Aldrich, who had by this point 3 children of their own, and who managed the addition of 2 more on anniversary evenings with cheerful competence. The dining house had changed and also not changed. The food was still good. The corner table was available, and they were seated there by Harriet Grubb's daughter with the same invisible intelligence that Harriet herself had demonstrated on the first evening they had ever sat there. They ordered and ate and talked, as they had been talking for 10 years, easily and honestly, and with the particular pleasure of 2 people who find each other continuously interesting. Chester told her about a new grazing arrangement he was considering with the Reeder family to the north. She told him about a conversation she'd had with the county commissioner about extending library services to the rural schools. They talked about Thomas's recent declaration that he intended to both run a ranch and manage a business when he grew up, which they agreed was either ambitious or practical depending on how you looked at it, and was probably both. 10 years, Chester said after a while. 10 years, she agreed. Are you glad? He asked, not with anxiety, with the simple desire for the real answer. She thought about the January morning she had stood on a train platform in St. Louis with $37 in her coat lining and Bertie's letter in her hand, and made a choice toward uncertainty. She thought about arriving in Caldwell with its raw lumber smell and its transient energy, and its particular quality of being a place that was still deciding what it wanted to become. She thought about building something from nothing on the south end of Kishom Street. She thought about a loose board on a front step and strong coffee, and a book passed between 2 people. She thought about standing frozen outside a general store with her arms full of flour, and the sound of a voice going quiet and certain on her behalf, and something breaking open inside her that she had thought was permanent structure. She thought about gray eyes across a kitchen table, about a December wedding in falling snow, about the weight of a sleeping baby, about a creek in June and the way a laugh can complete something you didn't know was incomplete, about 10 years of waking up beside someone who is exactly who he said he was. I am glad in ways that don't have adequate words, she said. I have tried to find them and I keep running out of language before I run out of what I mean. Chester looked at her across the table, the candlelight warm between them, and he smiled, the full rearranging smile, and reached across the table and took both her hands. Then I'll take the inadequate words, he said. They're enough. They're more than enough. She held his hands across the table in the corner of the Caldwell Dining House on their 10th wedding anniversary, and felt the fullness of a life she had built and chosen and was still, every day, choosing. Outside, Caldwell was settling into its December night, the streets quiet, the cold clean and still. The stars over the Kansas prairie were brilliant in the winter dark, the kind of stars you can only see in places where the darkness is deep enough to let them be themselves. The library they had built together had 3,000 books by now. The laundry business had 4 contracts with commercial establishments and 8 regular workers, and Clara Hatch's capable hands at its management. The ranch's north section was productive and well managed. Thomas was reading everything he could find and asking questions about how things worked. Catherine had just learned to ride and approached it with the complete confidence of someone who has never considered the possibility of not being able to do something. Margaret and James had made their home into something warm and full and good. Bertie and Ben Ames remained the friends who were also family, who knew the whole story because they had been part of it, who understood that you do not measure someone's worth in the approved categories of the frontier social order, but in the actual quality of what they build and who they are. Doyle Ransom was in Texas, and nobody much talked about him. Gerald Prout had retired from the bank, and his replacement had refinanced the Henderson homestead on reasonable terms as a matter of course rather than compelled conscience, which was progress. The injustices of the world around them were not solved, and would not be solved in a generation. The forced removal and the broken treaties, and the particular calculations that decided whose land was whose and whose life was whose. But Opal named them when she saw them, and Chester stood beside her when she did, and together, they were the kind of people in a community who make it slightly harder for the worst things to go entirely unexamined. It was enough for one life. It was more than enough. Chester paid the bill and they walked out into the December night, his hand warm around hers, their breath visible in the cold air. They walked back through Caldwell toward their horses, past the general store that had been the scene of a particular afternoon in May of 1882 when Opal Finley had stood frozen outside with her arms full of flour, and heard something that undid 10 years of careful fortification in 3 minutes flat. She stopped outside the store for a moment. Chester stopped beside her. He looked at the building and then at her, and she could see that he knew why she had stopped. "Right here," she said. "Right here," he confirmed. The night was still and cold and the stars were enormous overhead. The general store's dark windows reflected their shapes back at them. "I was so angry at you," she said after a moment. "Angry at me?" He was genuinely surprised. "Why?" "Because you made me feel something I had decided not to feel," she said. "I had those walls up for good reasons. I was proud of those walls. And you went and said a true thing on my behalf in a quiet voice, and the whole architecture collapsed in about 30 seconds. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not sorry." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm not either. I was at the time for about 20 minutes. He laughed, that real sudden laugh that she had first heard by the creek in June of 1882, and that still, 10 years later, rearranged everything in her chest. "20 minutes," he said. "And then what?" "And then you took my flour," she said, "and you carried it to the wagon without being asked, and I thought, well, there it is." He was looking at her with the full warmth of 10 years of looking at her and knowing what he saw. "There it is," he agreed. She turned from the store and looked up at him in the winter dark, this man with his steady gray eyes and his careful words and his absolute quality of meaning exactly what he says. "Take me home, Chester," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked through the December night of Caldwell, Kansas, away from the general store, and toward everything they had built together, with the stars overhead and the cold air sharp and clear, and the sound of their footsteps on the frozen ground, marking the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being exactly where they had chosen to be. The prairie spread out around them in the vast darkness, enormous and patient, the same land that Opal had arrived to 18 months before the moment that changed her life, the same land that had asked its particular price of hard work and weathered cold and the willingness to stand in it without guarantee, and paid back in the currency of real things, real life, real love. The kind that is built daily over years, and is therefore impervious to gossip and circumstance, and the ordinary failures of the world to be better than it is. They were home before the midnight cold fully settled, the ranch house warm with lamplight, Thomas asleep in his room with a book still open on the blanket beside him, Catherine sleeping with the complete abandon of a child who has tired herself thoroughly, the house holding its people quietly in the Kansas winter. Chester put more wood on the fire and Opal made coffee the way she always did, strong, because that was how they both liked it, and they sat at the kitchen table they had shared for 10 years and drank it slowly in the warm quiet of their house. Outside, the prairie was vast and dark and brilliant with stars. Inside was everything they had made together. It was, Opal thought, exactly enough. It was, Chester thought at the same moment across the table, more than he had known to want and everything he had ever needed. And the fire burned and the coffee steamed and the children slept and the stars over Kansas turned in their ancient, patient arcs. And nothing about this moment was dramatic or extraordinary except that it was real, entirely and completely and irrevocably real, which was the most extraordinary thing of all.